It's me, Steve Wojcik. Tonight we're going to talk about something most folks have never heard of, the Arkansas prison blood scandal. It's a story that starts at Cummins Unit of the Arkansas Department of Corrections, but the damage runs all the way to Canada, Britain, Japan, and beyond. And I'll say this up front, one reason this story stayed in the dark so long is because in our country a lot of people just don't care what happens to prisoners. Pew Research found that Americans are split on prison time. About a third say people don't spend enough time in prison, another third say about the right amount, and only about a quarter think sentences are too long. The American Medical Association's Ethics Journal points out that even though the Supreme Court has said prisoners have a right to medical care, many U.S. residents view this right of prisoners as unfair. And a national health survey found that among incarcerated people with a chronic medical problem, roughly 1 in 5 in state prisons and 2/3 of those in jails had never had a medical exam since being locked up. So when you mix that kind of public apathy with money, politics, and bad oversight, you get what happened at Cummins. Cummins Unit down in the Delta has a long, ugly history as a plantation-style prison farm. By the mid-1960s, the state was looking for new ways to make money off the men locked up there. In 1964, Arkansas started a prison plasma program. Men at Cummins could donate blood plasma. They were paid in prison script, usually around $7, while the state and its contractors sold each unit of plasma for many times that amount. On paper, this was a business deal. The state got revenue, prisoners got a little spending money, and blood companies got product. In reality, it was something closer to a blood farm. Over time, Arkansas turned prison health care and the plasma business over to the private outfit called Health Management Associates, founded by pediatrician Francis Bud Henderson out of Pine Bluff. HMA ran the medical side and the plasma side. The more blood they moved, the more money everyone made. Screening for disease was often terrible. Investigators later heard that some prisoners weren't paid in cash at all, but they were paid in drugs. There were stories of needle reuse between prisoners, the perfect recipe for spreading hepatitis and later HIV. One inmate clerk in the plasma center was accused of selling what he called the right to bleed, taking prisoners who had been excluded because of suspected hepatitis and putting them back into the donor pool for a price. Think about that. The very people most likely to be sick were sometimes the ones pushed to donate over and over because they needed the money and somebody else wanted their cut. By the early 1980s, the AIDS crisis was emerging, and the federal government finally started paying attention to where blood was coming from. In December 1982, the Food and Drug Administration warned that prisoners were much more likely than the general population to carry the AIDS virus. Many pharmaceutical companies stopped buying prison plasma right then. But instead of shutting the program down, Arkansas and HMA changed their market. HMA made a deal with Continental Pharma Cryosin, Canada's largest blood broker. From that point on, plasma pulled from men at Cummins was shipped to Canada, processed, and then sent out across Canada, Europe, and Asia. Some of it went to Connaught Laboratories in Toronto, where it was turned into clotting factor for people with hemophilia. Here's one of the most chilling details in the official record. The Canadian Crever Commission, which later investigated their side of the scandal, found that, and this is quote, the shipping papers had not revealed that the center was located in a prison. They simply referred to ADC Plasma Center, Grady, Arkansas. In other words, the paperwork hid the fact that this ADC operation was inside the Arkansas Department of Correction. The buyers knew they were dealing with Arkansas. They did not know, however, they were buying blood from prisoners. The problems piled up in 1983 and 84 after hepatitis contaminated plasma went out the door. The FDA actually yanked the license of the HMA Plasma Center. But the license was restored a few months later after the company and state officials argued that the real trouble came from one corrupt guard running a side hustle. The broader system stayed in place. In 1985, the Arkansas Board of Corrections hired an outside group, the Institute for Law and Policy Planning out of Berkeley, to look at how HMA was running prison health care and the plasma program. At the same time, Governor Bill Clinton ordered the Arkansas State Police to investigate. The independent Berkeley group came back with a long list of violations. According to the Encyclopedia of Arkansas, they found that HMA had violated its contract in about 40 different areas, including bad health assessments, poor records, and the use of unlicensed staff. The state police report looked very different. It basically concluded there had been some small time gambling among HMA employees. Governor Clinton urged that the investigation be wrapped up quickly. No one in the top ranks of the Department of Correction was criminally charged. The longtime director, Art Lockhart, kept his job for years, protected by powerful state Senator Knox Nelson of Pine Bluff. Meanwhile, politics and the blood business were intertwined. HMA's president, Pine Bluff banker Leonard Dunn, lobbied hard to keep the contract and later worked on Clinton's 1990 campaign. The company created an ombudsman job and hired Richard Mays, a Clinton appointed judge, on a 2-year, $25,000 contract. Only after the outside report became public did HMA finally lose its contract and dissolve. But the plasma program itself did not stop. The contract was handed off to Pine Bluff Biologicals, which at one point got 40% of its business from prison plasma. Screening problems continued. In one documented case, a prisoner who had been barred from donating because of disease managed to sell plasma 23 times after a transfer between units. Journalists and insiders kept pushing. In 1991, Mara Leverett wrote a detailed piece called Blood Money in the Arkansas Times laying out how inmate plasma from Cummins was being sold into the international market. Former HMA employee Mike Galster wrote a thinly fictionalized novel, Blood Trail, describing a prison blood program that looked a whole lot like Arkansas's. And Arkansas filmmaker Kelly Dudas spent years interviewing prisoners, staff, and victims around the world. His 2005 documentary is titled Factor 8, The Arkansas Prison Blood Scandal. The film and later summaries say that for more than 2 decades, Arkansas's prisons sold plasma from inmates infected with hepatitis and HIV, that needles were sometimes shared, and that records were falsified to keep the product flowing. One of the most striking voices is prisoner Rolf Castile. Interviewed for the documentary, he said the Arkansas system was riddled with, quote, graft, corruption, and money-making. Not long after speaking on camera, Castile was quietly shipped out of Arkansas to a prison in Utah. Years later, an Arkansas Assistant Attorney General admitted that this transfer was done in retaliation, punishment for talking. That's how the system treated a man whose crime was robbing a taco stand with a toy gun for $264. A man who served 40 years and still had the courage to speak up. So what was the damage? The Encyclopedia of Arkansas summarizes the Canadian numbers this way. More than 1,000 Canadians who received plasma contaminated by that drawn from Arkansas prisoners were infected with HIV and 20,000 with hepatitis C. Those numbers are from just one country. Canada's Creever Commission eventually concluded that tainted blood products, including those made from Arkansas prison plasma, infected thousands and killed many. The Canadian Red Cross was stripped of its role running the blood system and in 2005 pled guilty in court for distributing contaminated blood. After a class action lawsuit, the Canadian government set aside about $1.2 billion in 1998 and later added another $875 million to compensate victims. In Britain, tainted blood, including products traced back to U.S. prison plasma, infected over 6,000 people with hepatitis C and HIV. By the mid-2000s, more than 1,700 had died. That led to a long public inquiry, and in 2024, the UK government announced it would spend more than £10 billion, that's roughly $12.7 billion, compensating victims of the infected blood scandal. Now listen to this contrast. The Encyclopedia of Arkansas closes with this line about our state's response, quote, Arkansas has never apologized for its role in the blood scandal, nor sought to reimburse victims for their suffering. Canada and Britain have spent billions trying to make things right. Arkansas has never even said, we're sorry. This isn't just an overseas business either. At the bottom of that same encyclopedia entry, you'll find a comment from Ashley Garrett of Conway. She writes about her father who received a blood transfusion in a Little Rock hospital in 1986 and later developed hepatitis C. As she tells it, he lay in a hospice bed and asked her, quote, you'll get a lawyer, won't you, hun? Talk to Rainwater, hun. I know they'll help. I didn't have to be this sick all this time. He never got justice. Those are Arkansas voices. They're part of this story too. Now, you might say, Steve, these were inmates. Some of them were dangerous men. Why should we care if the state used their blood to make a few dollars? Here's why. First, whatever crime someone committed, once the state locks them up, the state has total control over their body. The courts have said denying medical care to prisoners can amount to cruel and unusual punishment. Second, disease doesn't stay behind bars. We used infected prisoner as a raw material, sold that blood around the world, and people who had never set foot in Arkansas, little kids with hemophilia in Canada and Britain, paid with their lives. Third, this scandal shows how easy it is for bad policy and weak oversight to hide behind our indifference to people in prison. When the public sees prisoners as disposable, it becomes much easier for a prison system, or a private contractor, or a politician to cut corners in ways they would never fly in a regular hospital. And last, here's a simple moral question. If we let our state quietly profit from the bodies of the people it locks up with no accountability when things go wrong, what does that say about us? The prison plasma program finally ended in Arkansas in 1994. By then, we were reportedly the last state in the country still selling prison plasma. The scandals, the lawsuits, the Canadian and British inquiries, the documentary Factor 8, they all came after that. Today, thousands of families overseas are receiving compensation checks, or attending memorials, or reading the names of loved ones who died from tainted blood. Here in Arkansas, most people have never heard of the Cummins Plasma Program at all. I'm not doing this episode to refight old partisan wars or to hang this entirely on one governor or one political party. There's plenty of responsibility to go around as usual. State agencies, private companies, regulators, and a whole culture that didn't care what happened inside prison walls. I'm doing it because this is a piece of Arkansas history that really matters. It's about how we treat people when they're at their most powerless. It's about what happens when we decide some lives are worth less than others. And it's about the long shadow that can fall from a place like Cummins all the way to a children's hospital in Toronto or London. If you've got family who lived through the hemophilia crisis in Canada or Britain, or if you know Arkansans who were infected after transfusions in the 70s and 80s, their stories are part of this as well. I'd like to hear from them and from you. This has been the 501 Coroner. Y'all be kind to each other, okay?